Good evening. Hello, I'm Lynn Turner, and I'm the first Vice President of NCA, and I'm delighted to be here and just delighted to see all of you here as well. Thank you. Thank you. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to our first State of the Discipline address to kick off our conference. In addition to this as the inaugural address, we're also stepping one small step for everyone into the world of virtual conferencing. So I'd like to give a little shout out to all of our friends who might be watching the webcast. We are testing the idea of webcasting 3 events, and this is the first one, so that we can kind of step into virtual conferencing and allow people who are not able to be with us at this conference to view some of our events in real time. And it's an idea that I think NCA will want to continue thinking about and talking about in the ensuing years, and we are indebted to Routledge Taylor and Francis Group for endowing these 3 webcasts to get us started. So our speaker for this evening of double firsts is David Zarefsky, and it is such a joy for me to introduce him. He is an extremely appropriate choice for an inaugural speaker, as he actually delivered the inaugural Carol C. Arnold address at NCA in 1995. In addition, he is a perfect choice to speak on the state of the discipline, as you'll see as I present just some of his impressive credentials. Dr. Zarefsky is Owen L. Kuhn Professor Emeritus of Argumentation and Debate and Professor Emeritus of Communication Studies at Northwestern University, where he retired in 2009 after 41 years. That seems hard to believe since he is only about 41, right? 41 years on the faculty. His teaching and research focus on argumentation and the history of U.S. public discourse. Among his publications are President Johnson's War on Poverty, Rhetoric and History, and Lincoln, Douglas, and Slavery in the Crucible of Public Debate. He is an NCA Distinguished Scholar and a 2-time recipient of the Winans-Wichlands Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Rhetoric and Public Address. He has received Distinguished Service Awards from the American Forensic Association, NCA, and the Rhetoric Society of America. He has chaired both the Finance Board and the Publications Board of NCA. He served as president of Central States Communication Association. He served as president of NCA. He served as president of the Rhetoric Society of America 2 times. In addition to this listing of Dr. Zarefsky's accomplishments, which I assure you is only a small sampling, I'd like to take just a moment for a personal reflection. In the early 1980s, when I was contemplating a career change from high school teaching, I sat in Dr. Zarefsky's office at Northwestern University, and he patiently and thoroughly answered all my questions about graduate school, or all of them that I could think of at that moment. His helpfulness and approachability helped guide me to a PhD at Northwestern and to my career. So in many ways, I'm standing here today thanks to you, David. And when I contacted him and asked him if he would consider making this speech today, he was equally helpful and gracious. I thank him for being there for me at the start of my career and in this profession, and I thank him for being with us and for me here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Zarefsky.
Thank you, Lynn Turner, for that generous introduction and for all the work that you have done in planning this great convention. Thank you, too. Thank you to my good friends at Routledge, Taylor & Francis, with whom I worked closely for a number of years, for your support to make this possible. And thank you, dear colleagues, both for giving me such a hearty welcome and for participating along with me in the experiment that this session represents. This is my 43rd consecutive NCA convention. Going back to the old Sheraton Chicago Hotel in 1968. And if you make due allowance for my age, that statement is not all that unusual. Because compared to our counterpart associations in other academic fields, NCA brings people together for its convention. We have a disproportionately high percentage of our members every year who come to this convention. The convention brings us all together. And as soon as we get here, it divides us all into what used to be about 15 or 20, and now are as many as 75 concurrent sessions. And so in a way, the convention is a large umbrella under which lots of different groups gather and congregate, and there are few occasions that are designed for us all to come together. With this innovation in the program, there is now one plenary event on each of the 3 central days of the conference, leaving aside only the first day and the last. And I applaud the planners and everyone who was involved in making this decision, at least until I found out they had asked me to speak. So let me make clear something about the nature of this occasion. This is not a scholarly lecture. We have for that the Carol C. Arnold Lecture, and I hope that you will all come tomorrow evening to hear Professor Patrice Bazanel, who is this year's Arnold Lecturer. And this is not any kind of official pronouncement like the presidential address, although I hope that you will all come Tuesday evening to hear President Don Braithwaite's address, which, if the program is to be believed, will touch upon topics similar to some of those I will get into in just a few moments. Rather, I see this as the equivalent of an op-ed piece in which I will express a point of view and share a number of opinion statements, which I believe to be true, but there may be something in them to offend everyone, and they are certainly contestable. These are statements that are grounded in my own experience in the corner of our field that I inhabit, but I hope are of broader application than that and will speak across our divisional boundaries and to all of us. Now you might wonder, why me on this occasion? I should make clear that I have no sharper insight into these matters than the next person, and I have a poorer predictive record than most. Truth to tell, this is the second time this year that I have felt victimized by bait and switch. When I was asked to do this, my original understanding was that I would be making brief welcoming remarks at a reception. But NCA has been very good to me over the years, and so even when I discovered that the assignment morphed into something quite different, I agreed to be the guinea pig to launch this particular feature of the convention. And besides, to tell you the truth, I have not had a really good opportunity to pontificate since I left the dean's office at Northwestern a decade ago. So I intend in what follows to do 3 things. I want to share with you some reflections on disciplinarity. I want to talk about a personal experience that I've had during the past year that has led me to reflect upon the state of our discipline. And then I want to present a number of predicaments that I think characterize our current state and invite us to make strategic choices and judgments that will affect our future. I've been asked to reflect on the state of our discipline, and as you can undoubtedly tell, there are a couple of key assumptions contained within that title. I am going to stipulate that if we are a discipline, we are in a state. But quite a bit of mental energy and anguish have been directed to the question, are we a discipline? It strikes me that the answer to this question is obvious. It is yes and no. There are some of the characteristics of disciplines that I think most of us would agree we lack. Universally accepted core knowledge, standard definitions of key concepts, common methods, widely recognized scholarly exemplars. Perhaps Aristotle's rhetoric would come close. And a widely shared agenda of topics and problems. Those are things that traditionally characterize disciplines, and most of those are areas that we don't have. But in other respects, we clearly are a discipline. We have, I think, one central focus, and that is the relationship between messages and people. All sorts of things count as messages, and people range from dyads, if not individuals, to entire cultures and world societies. Some of our work focuses on what the economists would call the production function. Everything that is involved in the making of messages by people. Some of our work focuses on what the economists would call the consumption function. Everything that's involved in the reception and interpretation of messages by people. But I submit that if we were to take even the voluminous printed program of this convention, which, with its 1,000 or more sessions, we could trace every one of them back in some way to this central focus. And goodness knows we have a disciplinary infrastructure. We have national, regional, state, and specialized organizations. We have conferences. We have journals. We have awards. We have divisions, committees, task forces, caucuses, all of the infrastructure that characterizes a discipline. Almost 40 years ago, Stephen Toulmin wrote Human Understanding, in which he distinguished among disciplines, and he used as his model of a compact discipline that had all of the characteristics I've mentioned, atomic physics. And then he talked about a continuum. We're certainly not a compact discipline. We may be a diffuse discipline. We may be a would-be discipline. Some would say we're undisciplined, and some would even say we're undisciplinable. And those were all of Toulmin's categories. But it seems to me that it is pointless to pursue this question very far once we understand what we indeed are, what characteristics we have, what characteristics we lack. We are what we are, and that shapes the issues that we face and how we need to go about facing them. I've actually been thinking some about this over the past years as a result of an experience that I had that was very significant to me. As some of you know, I had the privilege this past spring of serving as a visiting professor of English at Harvard University. How this came about is a long story in and of itself. Let me just say that it's one of several activities that followed from an initiative undertaken by our former executive director, Roger Smitter, who took it upon himself to reply to a news report about a review of the Harvard undergraduate curriculum, which found that Harvard was deficient with respect to the inclusion of oral communication experience in its undergraduate educational program. Simultaneously, I learned that Harvard was being routinely beaten up by its graduating seniors in their exit interviews for the lack of opportunities to experience oral communication or to study it. And I found that a number of faculty were concerned that otherwise very talented students, even very gifted writers, when called upon to make oral presentations in classes, somehow were deficient. And the question was, what to do about all this? It's clear to me that what most of the people there wanted was to build oral speaking presentation experience into classes across the curriculum. A smaller but very significant number wanted to have dedicated courses devoted to public speaking and communication. They have one such course at present. It's offered once a year for 12 students. And it attracts 100 to 150 applicants every time. A smaller but still significant number wanted to build upon such a course with advanced speaking opportunities, and a still smaller but not trivial number wanted to have the opportunity to study principles, approaches, historical work, criticism of communication. And Harvard's difficulty is figuring out how to respond to all of this within constraints of, first, believe it or not, financial problems that are serious given the way that Harvard accounts for itself. Second, within the constraints of existing administrative structures, there's no particular desire to create new departments or centers. And probably most challenging, to solve the problem of scale, how to get from a limited opportunity for a small number of students to a more generalizable one. And so they concluded that one of the things they ought to do was to invite somebody to come and spend the semester with them, teach a couple of classes, model some of these things, and talk with people there about some of these issues. And that's what brought me to Harvard. I taught two courses. One, a survey course in American Public Address, and the other, a version of the intensive course I've taught several times on the rhetoric of Abraham Lincoln. I also worked with teaching fellows, their term for TAs, who came from comparative literature and English and other disciplines, but who lacked any familiarity with our discipline or with the subject of my classes. I did limited outside work with individual students, coaching students who were competing to be selected as the class day speaker or to participate in the Boylston Oratory Contest, for example. And then very productively, I consulted with a number of individuals in the Bach Center for Teaching and Learning, which is where their existing speaking course is housed, and where there's a small cadre of people who are seriously interested in investigating oral communication as a means of learning and as a means of thinking that imposes special constraints related to reasoning with an audience. I had a fabulous experience. It was a great time. But let me tell you some of the things that I learned from it that touch upon our topic this afternoon. First of all, there is much more interest in our subject than in our discipline. Communication is ubiquitous. We're not the only ones who recognize that. It's seen as important across the academy, and certainly that was the case there. I found pockets of interest and teaching and learning in such diverse places as the Classics Department, the Government Department, and the Kennedy School. But nobody knew, or to be honest with you, cared, how our discipline is organized. When the time came to conduct a search to replace the person who had been teaching through the Bach Center, who was leaving because her husband finished his dissertation, they came to me and said, "Where in the world could we advertise or list such a position?" I said, "Have you heard of CritNet?" It was taken for granted that I and the subject I taught belonged in the English department. And indeed, many of my colleagues for a semester whom I met assumed that I was in the English department at Northwestern, much to the consternation of my Northwestern colleagues in English. Second thing I learned, there is no sense of arrogance or intellectual smugness suggesting that folks at Harvard might find our work lower on an academic pecking order than their own. Not once was I asked to defend who we are, what we do, why it's important. It was recognized that even though they couldn't define its shape, they knew that there was some body of experience and expertise that I was representing, and that I was there to help them draw upon it. Now, yes, there is provincialism. If something's not done at MIT or Yale, Harvard is less interested, but that's the result of simple provincialism, not arrogance. The third thing I learned is that what is old is new again. I think it is fair to say that my own work is located at what we would not usually refer to as the cutting edge of our discipline. American Public Address was once central to our curriculum. It now exists in many places on the disciplinary margins. But it was of great interest to outsiders. I was told to expect about 20 or 25 students to enroll in my class in American Public Address. Harvard has a unique registration system. Students don't register until after the first week of class, so they can shop around. And so it took me a while to know how many students I would have and what the structure of the course hence would be. But where I was told to expect 20 or 25, I had 100. Now, they certainly weren't coming because of me. I was an unknown quantity. And they were coming not only from the obvious places like government and history and English and comp lit, but from applied math, chemistry, evolutionary biology, foreign languages. There was something about this subject that spoke to them in very meaningful and important ways, and they were joined over the course of the semester by a group of visiting scholars from China, a visiting professor of economics from Columbia, alumni who came back for various meetings and events, and much to my surprise, I found the admissions office had listed this course as one of the places for prospective students and their parents to visit because they thought it would help them understand Harvard's role in educating leaders and training people to be effective and competent citizens, which after all was the justification in our own field for this branch of study 3 generations ago. And so I learned that the progress of a discipline is in a circle as well as in a line. That while it advances and moves forward into new areas, it also builds upon and refreshes its traditions. Now that leads me, as I promised you, to some reflection on where we are. What is the state that we're in? And what are we up to? And I'm going to share with you briefly 5 predicaments. They're from what could be a much, much longer list. And I suspect if each of us engaged in this exercise, we'd each have our own list. But here's mine. First of all, it is very hard for us to identify, much less to forecast, disciplinary trends. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some things we can say pretty clearly. We know that we as a discipline have experienced over the past generation phenomenal growth in the numbers of our students who are attracted to us because we sit on the cusp of theory and practice, on the cusp of the humanities and social sciences, on the cusp of the liberal arts and the professions. And so we're in a very convenient place that has great utility for them. We know as a result that the job market for emerging graduates, while undoubtedly tighter than it's been in quite some time, is nowhere near as tight as it is in some of the more traditional disciplines like English, history, or philosophy. We know that in every area of our work, in every division, in every subset that we might identify, we have experienced over the years great increases in the sophistication of our work, in the questions that we ask, in the ways that we go about answering them, and we know that we have also experienced greater specialization on those same dimensions. NCA has grown over this same period of time, but by nowhere near as much as the number of divisions or the number of convention programs have grown. We can say all of those things, and they're all, I think, sources of pride, although in some cases also sources of concern. But if asked, well, what for the discipline as a whole are the trends? What are you moving into? What are you moving away from? It may just be me, but I have a hard time answering that question. Some have said we're moving increasingly into applied settings and particularly to workforce applications of communication. That's true. But at the same time, we're deepening our inquiry into communication philosophy, communication ethics, and communication history. Where are we going? Both ways. Some have said we're moving increasingly in the direction of empirical studies, and the social sciences are increasingly dominant. Others have said we're moving to a stronger position in the humanities, and interpretive and critical research is playing a greater role. And they're both right. So what do we say about the discipline as a whole? Some have said we're moving increasingly to focus on communication in personal life. rather than studying the great orators or the great debaters or the great negotiators of the past or present. And that's true. But at the same time, we're far more occupied than we've ever been with civic engagement, with the involvement of the individual in the life of the society, with concerns about the health of the culture and of our civic life. Some have said we're increasingly concerned with arcane research and theory building to the neglect of our pedagogical tradition. And others have said pedagogy rules the association and we don't take research seriously, and this time they're both wrong. We go in many directions all at the same time because of our very breadth, because of the ubiquitous nature of our topic. And if we were to move very far on any of these axes, we would quickly get pulled back, because one of the things about this discipline is that all of its divisions and probably all of its members find it very easy to believe that they are underserved and undervalued. And that brings us to a state of rough equilibrium. But if we can't say where we're going, it seems like we don't know who we are. And that's the conundrum. We can't do everything. We face limited resources. We can only pursue so many initiatives at a time. We do want to make strategic judgments, and yet it's very hard to identify the trends in which we're heading. That's my first predicament. Second one comes from the fact that as a discipline, for at least the past 50 years, and I'm going to take that as a convenient dividing point, whether it goes back further or not is arguable, but for at least the past 50 years, we have shown a decided preference for addressing the contemporary. This has been true across the discipline. In the 1960s, it was rhetoric that was affected by this tendency, because we saw all around us in the world new forms of persuasion, breaking down the traditional distinction between persuasion and coercion, that did not recognize our traditional norms of rational discourse. And so we rushed to study the rhetoric of social movements, the rhetoric of agitation and control, and we said, in this kind of world, with this all around us, how can we justify spending our time on Cicero and Quintilian? In the 1980s, interpersonal and small group communication was particularly affected by the desire to study formal organizations, especially in workplace environments. And so organizational communication came into its own. Not only as an object of study in its own right, which of course it is, but the argument was made, how can we talk about informal conversation or small group discussion when the reality is that most small group interaction takes place within an organizational setting? And of course, in the past decade, it's been media studies that has been affected by this preference for the contemporary because, of course, of the technological revolution. And so departments and programs have raced to offer curricula and to hire specialists in technology and new media. Now, please don't get me wrong. Every one of these moves has been valuable. Every one of these moves has strengthened our field and has brought into our ambit new and important objects of study. But I want to focus on the argument that is often made for moving in these directions, namely that older, more traditional areas of focus have become passé. Indeed, if there is an epithet in our discipline, it is the word traditional. As though renewed attention to old issues or bringing the insights of old methods and perspectives to new issues is by definition unproductive. I had an interesting experience recently that relates to this. One of my more exotic publications that is soon to appear, in collaboration with two industrial psychologists whom I've never met, we've worked entirely on the internet, is a response to an essay about evidence-based practice in industrial psychology and in the professions more generally. And the argument's been made there that the characteristic of evidence-based practice is a very healthy skepticism about new ideas and new perspectives. Not because they're wrong, but because lusting after the new prevents the accumulation of knowledge tested and replicated that makes the base of evidence on which evidence-based practice is derived. And indeed, if we were to do a little thought experiment and ask ourselves, for whatever kind of communication practice we might want to imagine, from the smallest to the largest, what are we basing our practical advice on? We would be inclined, I think, to make an answer like the industrial psychologists make. Well, there's all this research out there. And it turns out there isn't all this research out there. Even on some of the most traditional of rhetorical topics, like the speeches of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, you'll be surprised. There's not all this research out there. And so if what we want to do is to accumulate the kind of knowledge base that I said earlier characterizes a discipline, then we have to not abandon our concern for the contemporary, but to balance it with a renewed concern for the traditional. The most controversial NCA presidential address that I have heard in all the years that I've been to the convention was delivered in 1969 by Professor Marie Hockmuth Nichols. It was titled The Tyranny of Relevance. It was controversial in its time. It was widely understood to be a polemic against our involvement with the issues of the day. Read from the perspective of 40 years later, we can see perhaps a different kind of tyranny of relevance, where if we have to navigate a tension between building a disciplinary core and pushing the envelope, we may be failing to do both. Traditions exist for a reason, and traditional is not a bad word. At the same time, the world is not static, and we must embrace and address the contemporary as well. Third predicament. How do we balance our commitments to scholarship and to pedagogy? We have a very strong tradition as a field. It is a teaching tradition. It goes back to ancient Greece, and it's as current as a field today. In some quarters, however, we seem to be willing to walk away from this heritage because teaching, while we all love to do it, is seen by our institutions, perhaps, by our colleagues, perhaps, and let's be honest, by ourselves, perhaps, as less prestigious or rewarding than scholarship. Except for those of us who have chosen to specialize in pedagogy, perhaps at the price of losing connections with scholarship in the field other than instructional communication itself. I believe that we have, to an unhealthy degree, segmented our concern for scholarship and our concern for teaching, and that they do not interact with each other as productively as they should, and perhaps even as productively as they do in some other disciplines. Some of us have bought into the stereotype of research ones as unconcerned with teaching, and hence the model for the discipline. I can tell you that is not a true stereotype. Others of us have bought into a stereotype that says scholarship is esoteric and not useful. It won't help me teach my class next week, and as a result have reneged on our commitment to stay abreast of scholarship. We disconnect scholarship and pedagogy, and as I mentioned, each community that results feels itself underserved. We have to figure that out. The times demand that we figure that out. A fourth predicament. How do we want to position ourselves strategically? Do we want to be a service discipline? Well, there's great benefit in that. We can be known across the academy. Resources can flow that way. But it raises issues of who works for whom, and the question of whether we're going to be defined by our own agenda or by the needs of others. What's more, you don't need me to tell you this, that in moments of fiscal or other constraints, service disciplines, arguably marginal to the intellectual mission of an institution, find themselves in peril. Well, then, do we want to be a self-contained discipline pursued for its own sake? That's a luxury. It doesn't follow from a commitment to the importance of the subject that we can pursue it in splendid isolation. We're not a field like chemistry or English or philosophy where such splendid isolation might be justified because in today's category system they're seen as central to the liberal arts. Well, then, do we want to mix and mingle with other disciplines? Perhaps so, but then the question is, what do we bring to the table? What is the value that's added? Well, we say, there's communication related to everything. And so we can bring value to this conversation and this conversation and this conversation. And that's true insofar as, like Harvard, people value our subject. But it doesn't follow necessarily that we can bring something to the table that somebody else can't. And if we can, have we paid our dues to be regarded as credible and trustworthy at the table? This, of course, is the conundrum of interdisciplinary scholarship. There's interdisciplinary and then there's interdisciplinary. And strong interdisciplinary programs are usually built on multiple disciplinary foundations, and yet there's a common conversation in which they participate. In order to make myself credible among Lincoln scholars in different disciplines, I had to not only be familiar with what I thought were relevant precepts of our own discipline, but to read very widely in the scholarship of a number of other disciplines to be able to talk the same language. And that's part of the price that we have to pay if we go that route. It's not clear to me which of these routes we should take or some combination of them. But I think part of the characteristics of the state of our discipline is we don't really know. We don't really know. And we need somehow to try to figure out what the answer will be. And the final predicament I want to mention. what do we say and do with the politics of our discipline? Now, I don't mean the Legislative Assembly versus the Finance Board. I mean this question in a much more fundamental sense. Our discipline is rooted in politics. In ancient Greece, it was rooted in the need for citizens to be able to appear in public and in court and to defend themselves and claim their rights. And in our modern discipline, the discipline that NCA grew out of and helped to form in the teens and the 20s, we were profoundly influenced by the ideology of the progressive movement that citizens were to be empowered to participate competently and effectively in public life. And indeed, what justified our role in the academy was our role in the training and cultivation of citizens. Behind the politics of our discipline is the assumption of human agency. We believe that people, individually and collectively, can make a difference and can bring about consequential results. Now there are people who would argue that our discipline should be utterly divorced from politics, as mathematics presumably is, or as the other compact disciplines cited by Toulmin often are. Others raise what may be an even more vexing problem, and that is, how can we reconcile our faith in human agency with what we know about postmodernity? What we know about a world in which complex institutions and large social forces are able often to resist human agency and sometimes even to displace it. If a system is so hegemonic that the course of events is always already determined, then what's the point of trying to do what we do, to understand human communication and to train people to be better at it? And yet the answer is not to deny the present predicament either. Now, each of these 5 strategic questions is a conundrum. It poses choices among alternative futures. There is no easy answer. And yet, these are questions that we evade at our peril. We evade them at the price of permitting our future to be defined not by us, but by others. And so our most general challenge, I think, is how to develop strategies and priorities that play to and build upon our strengths while minimizing our weaknesses. And this is particularly hard because if you've listened carefully through these 5 predicaments, it surely occurred to you that our strengths are also our weaknesses. That is a characteristic of communication as an academic discipline. On the other hand, we have the creativity, if marshaled, I think, to address these issues. We meet, dear colleagues, in a troubled place at a troubled time. The issues in the city of San Francisco, although they seem to be less visible to San Franciscans than to visiting academics, have made it impossible for some of our colleagues to be here in person and have caused all of us to think carefully about what we believe about means and techniques of persuasion and interaction and negotiation and discourse. We have just completed midterm elections, the results of which some may celebrate and others mourn, but I venture to say that no one will argue that the quality of the campaign and the discussion of the serious issues we face met or even approached even modest standards that we would impose as a discipline. And we face national and world problems that relate in central ways to the communication of trust and the building of relationships across boundaries, to deliberating effectively, to evaluating claims and arguments, and to creative thinking, to the ability to use the resources of invention to find ways to overcome what looks like an impasse. And these are the things that at our core we are well equipped to do. In the face of such challenges, it may seem like collective navel-gazing for us to start off the convention focusing inwardly on the state of our discipline. Yet I believe that's what we need to do in order to understand and draw upon our capacities in order to make a difference, to recognize choices we must make among alternative futures, and to act together with confidence to make our future even stronger than our past. Thank you very much. I don't know how we all